So hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and I'm just here at a village kuti in Gampaha and thought to record a short Ovāda for the internet. So I thought I could start with just a little meditation, so I can lean forward a little bit and arch the spine, and look about 3 feet in front, and close our eyes. And can focus in on the breath. Can know when it's coming in, and know when it's going out. If we breathe in a long breath, can just know I'm breathing in a long breath. And if we breathe in a short breath, can just know I'm breathing in a short breath. And can just pose the question in the mind, what would be a really comfortable way to breathe right now? And then one can just let the body respond on its own. And if the mind wanders off to the past or the future, can just bring it back to the present moment, to the breath. And before we finish meditating, can spread thoughts of goodwill, wishing may all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can make the mind infinite, can make it unbounded, all the way to the ends of the universe and beyond, in every dimension. May all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. and can open our eyes and do a short Ovāda for the internet. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So hope that everybody is keeping well wherever might be. And there's a very important meditation topic by the Buddha called Maranasati. Maranasati means mindfulness of death. It's kind of There's different ways that he recommends it. One of the ways is, for example, for a monk living in a forest, then he should recollect that there's a lot of different things that could happen to me. I could be walking and I could step on a snake, the snake could bite me and that would be the end of my life. Or I could trip and fall and that would be the end of my life. And it sounds kind of funny saying trip and fall. Well, it sounds kind of unusual maybe, trip and fall, but you see some of these places in these forests, you can trip and fall and then there's like these hills, and these hills sometimes have these kind of like very wet spots, these streams, and you could just slide all the way down this hill, and that would probably be the end. So there's a number of different ways that a person can pass away. This is one way, and basically another kind of implicit way that one can kind of gather is that basically a person's life is impermanent. It's not something that one can place much weight on. Eventually it's going to end, and it can end at any time. So it's something that can be used to arouse heedfulness, in the sense that I only have a limited amount of time, so I better use it as best I can. And it's also something that can be a topic that one uses to basically uproot one's attachment to life. Attachment to life, attachment to death, both the same thing. You can't get one without the other. You can't get being alive without being dead. You live and then you die. So any time that a person takes birth in whatever form, whether a person or an animal, they end up dead because of that birth. That's the reason. So I was just, Vasa ended just the other day, and a monk sent me this message. He said there's a monk here in Sri Lanka who has terminal cancer. He's like, did you hear about this monk? He has terminal cancer. And apparently he's not doing too well. His cancer is terminal. So he said, we go see him and these kind of things. And when the Buddha describes this kind of mindfulness of death, there's a way that he describes it. He describes it in terms of like a horse sometimes, or at least in one occasion in the suttas. And he says there's people who, when they basically see the shadow of the whip, they go. And there's people who, I think when the whip maybe touches their skin. And there's people who, when the whip, or people know horses, when the whip touches their skin, and horses, when the whip penetrates their skin and draws blood, they go. And then there's horses who the whip actually has to penetrate to the bone, and then they go. And so a person who is like the horse, who goes right when they see the shadow of the whip, that's just somebody who hears. So maybe somebody has died, they've never heard of them before. They just hear that they've died and they think, well, I'm subject to death too, I'd better go. I better get going. And then the person who basically keeps going in order, the person, it gets closer and closer, and the person who basically their blood is drawn, like the horse who goes when their blood is drawn, it's like their friends and relatives die and they think I'd better go. And then the person who the whip has to touch the bone, it's when they almost die. They basically contract a severe illness, as far as I remember, and then they go because of that. So this is something that basically, death is something that underlies life, and it's something that people often don't like to think about because it puts life in perspective. It makes one question why one is doing the things that one is doing. What's the purpose for which one is doing these things? Sometimes at the end of a person's life, I was sent this kind of digital cartoon, and it's got this man, and he's kind of running, and there's this dollar in front of him, and he keeps running, and gradually his body dissolves and he falls into the grave. The dollar goes away. That's kind of not something that's meant to. It's not something that necessarily has to be depressing. I mean, people have to run after money or these various things, and they need it to survive to a certain extent. But all the time there has to be this question: why am I doing this? What is the purpose behind which I'm doing these things? Why am I doing this? Remember when I was young, in Western philosophy, at least before, I don't know how it is now, but when I was young, there was always this question, like, what is the meaning of life? Because at that time you had science and you had Christianity, and now Buddhism is becoming more prominent, but there wasn't necessarily a meaning for why these things were happening. It was kind of why we're alive and why we're chasing after things. What's the purpose? It's kind of, you chase after all these things and then you die. So in Christianity, it was like, well, it's just mysterious, it's God's will, so just don't worry about it, and try to do good and you'll go to heaven. Which, if you do good and go to heaven, that's an excellent thing. And science is basically all this world based. It's just, you're born biologically and this is how the cells divide, and then, your brain dies and this is what happens. There's always this kind of question: what is the meaning behind all of this? Why are we doing these things? I remember, so it was like a big philosophical question. And I remember there was one time in 7th grade that our teacher, she asked the class, she's like, what do you think the purpose of life is? And so I had all these different questions. And I put my hand up and I said, well, I think I was thinking about it. It was, the purpose of life is to be happy. Why else are we here? So I put up my hand and said, the purpose of life is to be happy. And she's like, no, that's wrong. So I don't think I would have gotten any correct points for that on the test. But when we think about it, actually the reason why we do everything is to be happy, is to avoid suffering. So this is the purpose for which we live. And it's not just the case that chasing after money or these kind of things doesn't give any pleasant feeling to people. Actually, if you have money and you've got a house and a car and you go on vacations, these things, it gives a certain type of pleasant feeling. But the question is, a larger question in this kind of search for happiness is, how much does it give? And what are the limitations of it? When we don't have life and death in our mind as a framework, then these things seem really worthwhile to go after. Actually, it's a comforting thought for a lot of people that at the end of their life they'll just become stardust and there'll be nothing left of them, and they won't have to face the consequences of their actions. I remember there was one time I was living with a fellow, actually. It was in Canada, and he invited me. I had this kind of stomach problem, and I was hoping to go to Sri Lanka, but couldn't go at that time. And he invited me to go and stay in his house for a couple months, just to help my stomach recover. So I did. I went and stayed with him. And he became more and more aggressive about this topic of rebirth. He got more and more kind of aggressive about it. I was kind of, well, I don't care if you don't believe in rebirth, it's no problem. But he was very aggressive and adamant that there should be no rebirth. And later I found out that he'd lived this kind of very unskillful life early on in his life. And so he was always saying, well, people aren't strong enough to accept that you're going to die and they're going to be stardust, and or not stardust, but there's going to be nothing after that. But actually, it takes a certain amount of strength to accept this, because if we have as the framework of everything we do this matter of life and death, then there's going to be serious consequences for our actions if there is another life after this. If there's another state of becoming after this, then what we do means a lot, and the bad things that we do will catch up with us. So it's in this context of the larger question of life and death, this big problem of life and death, that these things start to take meaning. Because when we see chasing after, we might say, just external sensual pleasures, anything external, these things are very fleeting. You kind of get them and they go away. A person spends their whole life doing this, and at the end of their life, they wonder, what was the point? What do I have of that left? It's kind of this rat race, kind of running around that. One step up from that is that if a person lives this kind of moral life, if they live a good life, they do good deeds, they practice generosity. I remember there's a gentleman I knew very well, and he was really into science, and he basically I think he was just anti-rebirth a little bit. But there was one time towards the end of his life, he just out of the blue said to me, he's like, well, I know I'm not going to heaven. I don't deserve it. So there's this sense that people have of what might come after. And people can kind of know this for themselves. And when a person lives their life doing good deeds, helping people, keeping morality, then at the end of their life, they feel like this is a life that has meaning. And they may not necessarily know how to ascribe why it has meaning. Why does it have meaning? When we look at these things in the context of happiness, we can see that this kind of chasing after sensuality, that the happiness one gets from it, it just diminishes more and more, the more one gets. And the more evil, or if one does bad things to get these sensual things, then it has a bad effect on one's mind. The mind itself becomes this dirty, unpleasant place to live. And so actually, you might say this type of happiness is something that can lead downwards if one pursues it exclusively. We practice morality, we practice generosity. This is something that, in addition to doing these external things, it gives us this internal type of happiness, this internal type of confidence. And this is a higher level of happiness. It gives this kind of unspoken meaning to life. It's something that's very good. But when we really think about the matter of life and death, so long as one is continually getting reborn, then there's no escape from having to encounter these things over and over again. And the chances for getting reborn in good places, like a human realm, is relatively small. Most people go to the animal realm. Most people go to hell. And so this is why the Buddha has these reflections. Like, think about how many animals there are in the sea. Like, just on the earth, or on the sea alone. As far as I remember, this is in one of the suttas. It's just an immense number. The number of animals living in the sea. And just think about the number of ants in the ground. And kind of in one city block, there's just this huge number of ants and worms and bugs living on the ground. And that's in a city, never mind a forest. So when we consider it this way, the fact of rebirth means that a person has a much higher chance of getting reborn in one of these lower planes. And so it's not something to celebrate necessarily. It's not like we just come back and we're in a middle-class house again in suburban North America or Europe or something like this. It doesn't work that way. That's very rare. That happens, very, very rarely. It's more likely we'll be born as an animal, or born in hell, or born as a ghost. So when we consider these things in a larger perspective, what it means is that so long as we're doing something that's good, that's meaningful, that's excellent, but the thing that has the highest meaning is actually to try to escape from this cycle. And you can see this as a monk. I was once staying at a monastery, and there was a monk there, the chief monk, the abbot there was widely regarded to be an arahant, and it was a very inspiring place to be. He was kind of constantly recommending you should just sleep 4 hours a night, and then basically spend the standard was sleep 4 hours a night, and then spend your day doing walking and sitting meditation. And that was basically it. And you had this kind of one meal of the day. They had quite a lot of gila and pasa there, but one meal of the day. And we got sent to one of his branch monasteries one time, and the abbot there, he was a former engineer. And when we went there, we went as a group. We went as a group to visit with another abbot. He took us on a tour. And the abbot of this branch monastery said to us, he said, I've done so many good things in my life. I've done, I've been building, ponds and, helping out with monasteries because he was an engineer. He knew how to do these things. But he says, I basically never turned my mind in the proper proportion to meditation. So you could see he had this kind of regret. So the highest thing that a person can do with their life is to actually spend their life trying to find an end to suffering. This is the actual purpose for which we live our life. And so long as it's in this kind of haze, there's this matter of life and death, people don't want to think about it, so they chase after sensuality. Or people think about it a little bit more, what's the meaning behind this, and they do good. This is an excellent thing. And as a result, they get reborn in a good place. But the problem is not really solved until we focus in on the problem at its root, this problem of suffering. And the Buddha has kind of taught a path to the ending of suffering. And this is the best way that a person can spend their life. At the end of a monk's life, if they get diagnosed with terminal cancer, if they've spent their life on meditation, if they've spent their life on practice, regardless of whether they're famous or not, regardless of whether they're the abbot of a big monastery or not, regardless of how many projects they've done or not, at the end of their life, they don't regret that. It's something that attacks the problem at the root. It's something that points directly towards the purpose for which we are living, the purpose for which we think we want to exist. It's kind of to be happy. So all the time this question has to be hanging over a person's mind. What is the reason for which I'm doing this? Why am I alive and why am I doing it? And then there has to be this evaluation. Is it really giving me what I want? Am I really getting what I think I should from this? What is it that actually makes me happy? Because when we have this question in mind, then we can become like the horse that the Buddha describes. It just sees the shadow of the whip. They just hear or just reflect that there is this person who died. I too am subject to death. This will happen to me. So what's the best way that I can spend my time? What's the best way that I can live my life so that at the end of my life, I won't feel regret? So this reflection on Maranasati, this reflection on mindfulness of death is something very, very important. It's a very important meditation topic given by the Buddha. And so long as it's used well, if it's used to its fullest, it's something that can culminate in the deathless, the Buddha teaches us. Because it gives us this spur. It gives us a spur to find what's really meaningful. And we know that one can know that so long as one is born, one is going to die. It's inevitable. And suffering will follow on that. So one has to direct one's mind towards something that's unborn, towards something that's uncreated, and towards something that's unconditioned to find what one's really looking for. And this is what we're searching for in life. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.